They called him Crazy Judah. Theodore Judah was the railroad engineer and surveyor responsible for bringing the first railroads to California. Being one of the thousands to take the long and dangerous journey to the West Coast, Judah dreamed of the potential for a transcontinental railroad. He began working hard to see his dream become a reality. He and his wife would travel back and forth from east to west coast, conducting land surveys, gathering information, and ultimately gaining supporters for his mission. In 1857, he published a pamphlet called A Practical Plan for a Pacific Railroad, which he distributed to congressmen in Washington, D.C. The Transcontinental Railroad had gained much political attention. While Judah conversed with congressmen in Washington, D.C., another important meeting was taking place in the small Iowan town of Council Bluffs. Grenville Dodge was another railroad engineer and surveyor. He was said to know more about railroads than any two men in the country. On this day, he was approached by an Illinois politician who asked him, "Dodge, what's the best route for a Pacific railroad to the west?" Dodge replied, "From this town out the Platte River Valley." Dodge had surveyed the wild land and found it to be flat with few obstructions. In other words, it was perfect for laying railroad track. The politician was convinced. Dodge didn't know it at the time, but he had just convinced the 16th President of the United States. He had just convinced Abraham Lincoln.
So Lincoln goes back to Illinois, then he ends up running for president. The next year he becomes president, and the South secedes from the Union. So in Congress, nobody could make a decision about what route to choose because the South wanted the southern routes, the North wanted the northern routes, and nobody could really get it together to decide. When the South seceded, suddenly the northern congressmen and senators could choose what route they wanted. So they picked a route, went to Lincoln. Lincoln remembered what Dodge said and actually made the terminus here in Council Bluffs in 1864.
With the massive project approved, surveyors, engineers, and explorers were hired to travel the frontier and find a precise route over rivers, through mountains, and across deserts. In the process of their adventures, they discovered more about the country than had ever been discovered before.
They started coming across as they were digging, they'd find fossils and things that they'd never seen before. They came across plants and animals that they'd never seen before. It was the first time that a number of these people had ever been out west before, so not since the days of Lewis and Clark have you had so many people that had been not only interested in getting a railroad through there, but learning about what the landscape was all about.
Theodore Judah, who was back in California, wanted to start his own railroad company to build the western portion of the transcontinental track. He spoke to dozens of businessmen and potential investors, but in the end there were only 4 who would dare take on such a massive responsibility. Charles Crocker, a dry goods salesman, Collis Huntington and Mark Hopkins, who co-owned a general store together, and Leland Stanford, a storekeeper and politician who was soon to be the governor of California. They collected a combined total of $159,000 and started the Central Pacific Railway Company. In July, President Abraham Lincoln signed the Pacific Railway Act of 1862, which brought the Union Pacific Railroad Company into existence. This company would lay track from Council Bluffs westward, while the Central Pacific would lay track from California eastward. On October 26, 1863, the Central Pacific spiked the first rails onto the ties. Construction had begun. But on that same day, Judah was to arrive in New York looking for new investors. When his ship came in, Judah was very sick and was rushed to the hospital. He had contracted yellow fever on his journey while traveling through Panama. He died a week later at the age of 37. With Judah gone, the Big Four faced their first big obstacle alone: the Sierra Nevada mountains. No railroad had ever crossed mountains like these, and the Central Pacific's workforce was dwindling. Where could they find more workers to blast through these mountains? It was Charles Crocker who found the answer. He suggested the Chinese. Chinese immigrants had been coming to America since the gold rush to find their fortunes. Once they had amassed enough hard-earned cash, they would return to China and live highly among their people. Still, many in the Central Pacific were skeptical, especially James Harvey Stonebridge, the head of construction for the CP. But Crocker persisted. They built the Great Wall of China, didn't they? Who said laborers had to be white to build railroads? Stonebridge relented and agreed to hire 50 Chinese for a month as a test. After a month, Stonebridge would grudgingly admit the Chinese men had done well and worked harder than any other man. From that point forward, Chinese immigrants would forever be tied to the building of the Transcontinental Railroad, and therefore tied to the future of the nation. By 1868, to 12,000, 80% of the Central Pacific's workforce. On a visit to the Central Pacific camp, Grenville Dodge would say this of the Chinese: very quiet, good cooks, good at almost everything they're put at. Only trouble is, we cannot talk to them. While the Central Pacific blasted through the mountains, the Union Pacific had their own issues across Nebraska and Wyoming. Indians were attacking. The Native Americans were being cheated. Their lands were being cut in two by the railroad. In addition, the railroad track separated herds of bison, disrupting migration patterns that the Native Americans depended on highly.
So Union Pacific started having to ask the Army for additional support to protect crews as they were constructing the railroad, because the Sioux and the Cheyenne were so effective at protecting their way of life.
Some Indian tribes, like the Sioux and the Cheyenne, would fight back by derailing trains and raiding railroad camps. Their hearts were full of courage, and they displayed a terrible wrath. The Indian, in truth, no longer has a country. The Indian's first demand is that the white man shall not drive off his game or dispose him of his lands. How can we promise this unless we prohibit immigration and settlement? The end is sure and dreadful to contemplate. With the Indians unable to cause many more problems, the Union Pacific powered through Wyoming at a rate of more than 2 miles a day and sprouted many towns and cities as they traveled west, including the future capital of Wyoming, Cheyenne. While the Central Pacific completed Summit Tunnel, the first tunnel of its size in history, the Union Pacific also completed the Dale Creek Bridge, one of the greatest engineering feats of the 19th century. In 1868, both companies laid approximately 720 miles of track and turned their eyes to Salt Lake City, Utah. The race to Salt Lake City was fierce. Each company would lay 3, 4, 5 miles of track a day. On one historic day, Stonebridge's Irish and Chinese workers laid a total of 10 miles of track in 24 hours. In an effort to pick up speed, the Union Pacific hired Brigham Young and the Mormons of Salt Lake City to grade the land for track in exchange for money and other government lands. With their help, the Union Pacific was the first to reach Salt Lake City. Now the Union Pacific and Central Pacific were planned to meet for the very first time at Promontory Point, Utah. On May 10, 1869, workers, engineers, and politicians gathered as a group of Chinese symbolically placed the final rail. Leland Stanford proudly raised the ceremonial silver hammer to pound in the final golden spike. At that moment, a single word was telegraphed across the nation: done. And the world knew that the United States was connected from sea to shining sea. After the railroad was done, many of the workers went back home or made new homes in America. The Big Four watched the Transcontinental Railroad build a trading empire and watched themselves become very wealthy. Within 10 years, the railroad was shipping $50 million worth of products across the U.S. yearly. Not only that, but immigrants and settlers were now able to travel into America with ease and populate the land.
Before the railroad, it took you 7 to 12 months. It was $1,000 per person. It was very dangerous to travel from one coast to the other. After 1869, suddenly it would take you 7 days. It cost the average person about $100, and it was pretty much, pain-free as far as transportation went at the time.
The First Transcontinental Railroad was able to cross the expansive frontier, influence trade everywhere, and bring immigrants and Americans across the country to build their homes. America wouldn't be the same today without it.